Our next speaker is the absolutely fantastic Katie Fedosenko, who is speaking to us from one of the world's larger mining companies. She's recently relocated from North America across to the UK, but I will leave Katie to introduce herself and to pass across to yourself for your talk. Thank you very much, Katie. Round of applause.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and Ludovine, to the entire team, to Rose for having me here today. It's absolutely a pleasure. So as Sarah mentioned, I've recently relocated from Vancouver, and I've been with tech for coming up on 10 years. And my background is in sustainability reporting, and we're recently working with our innovation and technology group. And so for a topic near and dear to my heart, I thought I would talk today about how we're working to, as a large-scale mining company, build trust through transparency. It's going to change my views slightly because, quite as Sarah mentioned on a prep call, disconcerting to see only yourself as a full screen. I'd love to see all your faces instead. I want to start by saying that it was great to hear Minister Ghani talk earlier today about critical materials. And she was actually in Canada, in Toronto, a few months ago at PDAC, and she announced a Canada-UK supply chain dialogue on critical minerals. Absolutely, I think, what we need to see. And it's interesting looking at the critical mineral strategy for the UK. They have an ACE strategy, as I'm sure many of you know, and the E of ACE is enhancing international markets. And the key thing they talk about there is improving best practice in ESG and in transparency. And so that inspired me to focus my talk today on how transparency can help to build trust through responsible mineral supply chain. And just to share a little bit more about me, I'm a bit of an outlier in the mining industry. I have a degree in English. I was a freelance journalist and writer. And so personally, the power of storytelling and communication is really compelling. So to provide a bit of context about who we are, where we operate, how we work, I thought I'd just explain a little bit about tech. As Sarah mentioned, we're a relatively large company, one of the largest in Canada. We've been operating for 110 years now on the nose, which is crazy to say out loud. We produce copper, zinc, and steel-making coal, of course, in Canada, but also in the United States, Chile, and Peru. We're members of ICMM, or the International Council on Mining and Metals, and we implement their performance expectations. We're members of the Mining Association of Canada and implement their Towards Sustainable Mining protocols. I'm intentionally not using the acronyms right now. We're also working towards implementing Copper Mark. And I share that because I think that those external expectations continue to evolve, and I'm really glad to see that they do. I also hear a lot about harmonization of those standards, which I think will help make it a little bit easier for companies around the world to meet those expectations and to use them as part of their transparency. Those were our external commitments. Internally, we're guided by our pursuit of sustainability, with our goals to be net zero by 2050, nature positive by 2030, and improve our performance on a wide range of issues, from relationships with Indigenous peoples to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And while I think we're making good progress, one of the key reasons that we have a presence now in the UK and in Europe more broadly is because we really see everyone on the call today and so many other stakeholders at the bleeding edge of what best practice and responsible resource development. And in terms of what that looks like, a big part of my role is listening and learning and sharing that back with our management team. And when you think about that opportunity in terms of listening and learning, I wanted to share that two of our core values at Tech are courage and humility. They're two values that I really resonate with. And I think it takes a lot of courage, as I shared on a panel recently with GRI, to be transparent, to air your dirty laundry, to admit when you failed. And in the mining industry, there have been significant failures, including at Tech. And so I wanted to share two specific examples of how transparency has the power not only to build trust, but improve performance. And that first example, and I'm going to actually focus both on health and safety. The first example comes from a gap that we had in external health and safety reporting and internal information. And that was related to occupational disease rate. I'm getting pretty technical and gritty because I think when it comes to building transparency and building trust, we have to start with some really tactical examples. At Tech, health and safety, like at many mining companies, is a core value and strategic priority. And we believe it's possible to work without serious injuries and occupational disease. But occupational disease is typically a challenge to understand because there's significant lag time. When you're exposed as a worker at a mine, you may not develop an occupational disease maybe for decades after you spend time working on an operation. So in many cases, occupational disease happens with former employees instead of current employees. And you can appreciate that data about former employees is very difficult to collect. So this was happening about 7 years ago. At the same time, we were doing a lot of work to understand how we can improve how we showed up externally in terms of our transparency reporting and our scores and ranking on external rankings like the Dow Jones Sustainability World Index. And there's a lot of focus in these ratings, rightfully so, on occupational health and hygiene. And so when we saw that overlap, the reporting team and the health and safety team worked together to break down the barriers for collecting that occupational disease data. We started working in partnership with a workers' compensation board in British Columbia to collect that information and then ultimately seek approval from management. And when we did, there was very strong support because it helped to improve our external transparency, but I'd argue more importantly, it helped to improve our internal management systems because the more information that we had about what was causing occupational disease, the more that we could create controls today to help limit that exposure to our current workers. Today, we go even further on occupational health and hygiene reporting. You might know that it's common industry practice when it comes to reporting on fatalities to focus on the occupational fatalities of workers in your current workforce. However, due to the long nature of occupational disease developing, as I just explained, we decided that we would include those workers who are no longer at tech in terms of our total fatality rate. It took a lot of courage. It took a number of years to get there. We do it today, and we believe that it's a highly transparent practice that should be industry best practice and standard. Speaking of industry, I want to share an external example. We're working to eliminate fatalities, but unfortunately, we haven't reached that goal yet. And so when we have a potentially fatal occurrence, or heaven forbid a fatality does occur, we conduct an incident cause analysis investigation, or ICAM. I almost used the acronym right away, but I took the time to spell it out. And very sadly, when we had a fatality at our Red Dog operations in January of 2021 on a production drill, we conducted an ICAM. And we found that the key issue was on the safety critical controls for surface drilling operations. Of course, we share that across all of our operations around the world, but more importantly, we also shared it with all the other ICMM member companies, of which there's more than 20. And so our hope by doing that is that a similar incident will never happen again at one of our sites, and hopefully at hundreds of other mine sites around the world. ICMM member companies, also I recently learned, contribute to an annual health and safety report. And I think that's really interesting because monitoring and reporting on health and safety is increasingly shown to improve performance. It was really sad to see that in 2021, and you can see this in the ICMM safety performance report for 2021, that there were tragically 43 fatalities across the member companies, including the one that I mentioned at Tech. And when we took a closer look at the data, we realized that the most common hazard or the most common incident that led to a fatality was on the interaction of mobile equipment. So think about a light vehicle and a heavy vehicle like a haul truck. And so when we gathered that data, not only did we improve the transparency of reporting on one of the most critical ESG issues in the mining industry being health and safety, we also realized the common issues that we had and then created new working groups to help address and share learning. So ICMM has created subsequently a cleaner, safer vehicle initiative where we can both listen and learn to how we can make mobile equipment safer and help to promote those improvements across the board. Ensuring everyone goes home safe and healthy every day, which as I'm sure you can tell is one of our slogans, is essential to maintaining stakeholder trust and support for providing the critical minerals needed for the energy transition and to make people's lives better around the world. Both of these examples show that transparency not only builds trust, but helps to improve internal performance and performance around the world. And I'm really happy to say, especially as someone who led our reporting team, that it's not just reporting for reporting's sake. Looking ahead, I think really excitingly, we're seeing a convergence of those external reporting requirements and internal management practices and standards. So for example, we're creating digital dashboards for our general managers at our mine that track a wide range of performance indicators like equipment health, then also ESG data sets like water availability, tailing stability, lost time injuries. And so this data, unlike annual sustainability reporting or health and safety reporting, is coming in really frequently, sometimes on a real-time basis. And when you think about the rise of citizen scientists that can go out and monitor for air quality, they can monitor for noise, I think we as an industry, to keep building that trust by demonstrating transparency, we'll have to step up our game and think about how we potentially increase the quality and frequency of our reporting. With that, I'll pause there. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share a little bit from a practitioner standpoint, from mining company, and welcome your questions and comments.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Katie. Round of applause, everybody, for Katie, for her fantastic insight, exactly as she says, to the practitioner's viewpoint. So we've heard from a government minister. We've heard from people who bring to us some of the governance codes with regards to how do we talk about how much material we have in the ground and the sustainability aspects. And now we've heard from Katie, who's saying, well, this is actually what it's really like when we're trying to operate as an organization. So with regards to this, Katie, you mentioned the ability to actually collect in data on a much more live basis at the moment. Are you experimenting with reporting out to stakeholders on a more live basis, or is it something where that outwards reporting is still in that kind of more formalized, say, annual or 6-monthly manner, whereas internal reporting might be on a much faster cadence?
Reporting is absolutely on a faster cadence, but I think it's really interesting to look at the Global Industry Standard for Tailings Management, or GISTM, another acronym of the day. And under GISTM, there's a requirement to provide much more frequent updates on tailings dam safety and stability. There's also increasingly requirements from jurisdictions where we operate, in particular in Chile, also looking for that information. So as we're building a real-time digital dashboard for our Quebrada Blanca Phase 2 project in Chile for tailings management, we're looking at how we can take the modules that we use for internal management and then selectively make some that are appropriate and formatted for public use available online today. And so we're starting to take specific issues and use them to test and pilot. And my hope is that we'd be able to do that on a larger scale basis moving forward.
Excellent. And I'm loving the fact that you brought tailings dams into the room. So those are the waste storage facilities that, of course, almost any mining company needs to be able to deal with. And tomorrow afternoon at about this time, we've got Priscilla, who's an expert with regards to all things tailings dams. But another aspect, Katie, that I really, it's so painful when we think about occupational health and safety within the mining sector, because the sector does not have a pretty record. And I certainly remember back when I used to work with the ICMM, or the International Council for Mining and Metals, there was a huge amount of discussion around, well, if there is somebody who's hurt who is not an employee of that company, is that a reportable statistic? And I thought, hang on, how dare we? That's a human being. Have those discussions moved on since the 10, 15 years ago when I was stuck in that room having those debates with people?
I think we still, and we always have room to improve, but the definition, and we see this actually with the update from the mining sector standard from GRI, the definition of employee for health and safety purposes and the level of breakdown that we're expected to report includes both current employees, kind of full-time staff on your site, as well as contractors, and all, I think, going much further down the value chain. And so you may not see one full number for fatalities, you may see it as a breakdown, but that transparency and reporting for non-full-time employees has absolutely increased.
Mm-hmm. And then, so I guess then digging into the story that you shared with us around occupational disease. So if I understand that correctly, that was something where you were tracking down people who had subsequently left the company, but had developed that chronic illness, whatever it might be, potentially as a result of activities that they were exposed to whilst working for the company. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. And so that's what we had to work with in the British Columbian context, the Workers' Compensation Board, to gather that information, because they would submit that claim sometimes decades after they worked at Teck. And so it's an incredibly long lag time. And I think that's why it's so important to make sure that we understand those controls today, so that we're not unintentionally exposing people to things that will happen to them years down the road. And one thing that we shared with management at the time was that as we learn this information, as we get more sophisticated, our performance may seem good today, but it's because it's not a complete data set. And so talking about courage and humility, recognizing that up front, I heard that's loud and clear from our VP of Health and Safety at the time that as we start to go down this journey of increased transparency and reporting, our performance may actually go down as we learn more information and we can more readily gather it. We have systems and tools in place now where we're not as reliant on that lagged data from the Workers' Compensation Board, but it's still not a complete data set. And as we learn more, you may see our performance in that particular area decrease.
And I guess with that as well, it may be something which is never a complete data set as our understanding improves with regards to those diseases, etc. as well. So it may be this sort of iterative approach, but all the way through this, so long as the transparency is key and then taking action with regards to what you do know. Is that the kind of line that the company's taking?
I think that often in reporting, perfect can be the enemy of good. And so I think getting comfortable with an incomplete data set, with limited assurance, and just taking the first step to disclose is the most important thing. And I think it's easy as a large-scale mining company with a dedicated reporting team to talk about transparency. I'm becoming more and more aware of small to medium-sized mining organizations or resource organizations that may not have that same type of resourcing available to them. And I think at that stage, making sure that you're able to disclose to the minimum requirements of an incomplete data set is much more important than waiting to have the perfect and most complete data set. And one thing I would just quickly add as a sidebar anecdote, another thing that we're finding in terms of taking action on sustainability is not waiting for the perfect definition or common definition. I mentioned earlier our commitment to nature positive. That's not an agreed upon term around the world yet. What that means to us is different than what it means to Vale and to other types of organizations that have those commitments. For us, we wanted to start taking action now because we recognized and saw our opportunity to contribute to the reversal and ultimate protection of nature loss. We want to start today and adjust course as that definition continues to be refined around the world.
I'm loving that, Casey. And I think that that is a fantastic point to finish on. Just because we don't necessarily know what the concrete definition of something is, we still know what the principles are, perhaps that sit behind it. So there's no excuse not to take action, even though perhaps all the paperwork isn't in place yet. So awesome. With that, everybody, please put your hands together for the fabulous Katie. Thank you very much.